Hello, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about the role of advanced cyber infrastructure in our COVID-19 response. So back in March last year, as we were getting to understand the extent of this pandemic and its impacts, the question that all of us, our community, was asking ourselves was, how can CI, including high performance computing, HPC, accelerate progress in the fight against this pandemic, right? And at NSF, we quickly realized that computing and data were going to play an essential role, an important role, and we were trying to act as quickly as we could to start making these resources accessible to the community. And here are just a few examples. For example, early March, we immediately asked our resource providers, the PIs that operate many of the NSF funded resources, to provision these resources to support research against the pandemic or related to the pandemic. NSF also quickly mobilized the rapid response grants system to support COVID-19 research, and so on. Here is a link which talks about specifically around cyber infrastructure and computing and the activities that NSF undertook. At the same time, the broader community led by OSTP, NSF, DOE, IBM, and others were thinking about, at a much larger scale, how can we combine resources across federal government, industry, academia, nonprofits, put them together and make them accessible to the community in a quick, agile, expedient way, right? And this led to the formation of the COVID-19 HPC Consortium. There's a URL there. So this was a structure that came together quite organically, quite quickly, with the idea that given the importance of computing and data analytics in addressing, understanding this pandemic, developing cures, how do we make these resources accessible to the community quickly? The consortium was a partnership that came together with a few members, but has since grown over the past year quite organically. Today, it has 43 members, aggregating to over 600 petaflops of computing power, and has supported many, many projects. Right now, this is a dated number. It's over 92 at this point. It's closer to 100 projects that are operational at this point. So clearly, it has been a tremendous success and has demonstrated this essential role of computing and data. Over the next few slides, I'll talk a little more about the consortium and its impact. So as I mentioned, we started off with just a handful of members that came together in late March. I believe we launched on the 23rd of March, 2020, with a handful of members, just about a week after the first ideas initially were conceptualized and the discussion was started. So in a very, very quick turnaround, we were able to launch this consortium. But here's the list of members today. As you can see, it has grown quite extensively. It includes a range of academic, government, industry, and nonprofits. It also includes a number of international partners, for example, from the UK, Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So we have a bunch of different partners that came together to make this consortium happen. It's also funded a whole bunch of research activities. Here's a sampling. As I mentioned, there were a large number of projects that were running. Right here, this list, the 98 projects approved, and I put the slide together, right? And you can see the range of different activities that they have addressed, from basic science to the development of therapeutics to supporting patients and logistics and other activities. There's a URL at the bottom of that slide that takes you to the entire list of projects that are out there, right? Um, I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects. Clearly, this is just a small sampling, but to give you an idea of the range of activities that the consortium supported. For example, in basic science, we were able to support one of the first simulations of the binding of to sugar molecules that coat most of the viral spike proteins. And what this allows you to do is to really establish a new class of drug targets, right, as you explore antiviral therapeutics. In terms of therapeutic development, there was a project that was done by Alamgir Research. And what it did was it ran a novel molecular screening against over 1,500 FDA-approved drugs. And the idea was to identify candidates for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the coronavirus, to support its inhibition, right? And this was an idea was to find out how can you support the identification of drugs that could be used to address the pandemic. From the patient side, we had a bunch of different projects. For example, the project by John Davis was looking at transmission models using public data so that we could forecast hospitals and ICU beds, mortality, right? So that you can start doing the logistical planning that one needs. Another project by Amanda Randallsey, early career research funded by NSF, what she was able to do was to develop a model that simulates the airflow through a ventilator to enable the splitting of ventilators. Now, this was a time when ventilators were a scarce resource, and so this was a very important work that could explore how we could actually split the ventilator safely, right? And they did apply for FDA authorization or emergency rules, right? And so having the resources, she could do this very quickly. In this case, she was using Microsoft's resources, right? But she was able to do these studies very, very quickly so that we could do this in a timely way to address an urgent need. Another example is work around the differential gene expression among COVID-19 patient populations, right? To be able to study the long-term implication for treatment planning. Another piece of work by Som Datta at Utah State was looking at understanding the models and simulating the turbulence for aerosol transport um, uh, in an indoor environment. Again, allows you to model the transmission of the virus. So as we start thinking about, what scenarios are safe, how do we reopen, for example, schools, such a study would be extremely important. So you can see very diverse but very high impact, time critical research was enabled through making these resources accessible to the researchers, right? And as I mentioned, this is just a small sampling. You can go to the URL at the bottom of the slide to look at the overall set of projects enabled by the consortium. And there were some recognitions. For example, one of the research that was supported by these resources was received, this one led by Romy Amaro from UC San Diego, was given the ACM Gordon Bell Award for their research. And what they were trying to do here was to do one of the highest resolution simulations of the atomic structures of the SARS-CoV-2 spike dynamics. And again, this was done by a team led by Romy Amaro from the University of California at San Diego. So if you take a step back and see what happened as part of the HPC consortium, and are there lessons learned to responding to national emergencies more generally, right? So there are two sets of takeaways in my mind. The first one is the recognition that as we move forward, computing and data will continue to play an increasingly important role as we address these national emergencies, whether they are it's another pandemic, or it's a hurricane, or an earthquake, a wildfire, nuclear disaster. So a range of different emergencies, computing and data will continue to play a different role, right? And so if computing and data is important, then the advanced cyber infrastructure that includes computing, but also the ecosystem around it, the data, the software stacks, the networking, and most importantly, the expertise is going to become a national asset that, if you can mobilize it quickly, can be a tremendous impact in addressing these emergencies. Of course, that depends on the existence of this reserve. That means these resources, this advanced cyber infrastructure should exist uh, so that it can be mobilized when an urgent need arises. And this can only be done through long-term strategic investments. One of the key reasons why the COVID-19 HPC consortium was able to do what it could do, to have the impact that it could have, was the fact that it could leverage many decades of investments made by NSF, but also other agencies, and bring them to bear to address this pandemic, right? So having these long-term strategic investments is critical. So let me sort of walk you through some of these investments that the NSF has been making, right? So NSF, through its Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, has a mission to foster a cyber infrastructure ecosystem to transform all of science and engineering research. And it does that through deploying an integrated, holistic cyber infrastructure ecosystem, but also in doing the research needed to make sure that this cyber infrastructure is leveraging the latest technology, is addressing the emerging science needs. NSF has a holistic, broad view of cyber infrastructure. It definitely includes the computing systems, the HPC systems, but has a broader view. It also includes the networking, cloud services, software and data services, data infrastructure, the instrumentation, the coordination services and gateways, and other support structures. I think, and most importantly, the people and the expertise that are critical to really using the cyber infrastructure ecosystem. Increasingly, NSF has realized that this cyber infrastructure, the elements of this cyber infrastructure ecosystem can be effective when they come together. So when users can actually integrate the networking and the computing and the software and data services and the cloud services, the people, and use them collectively towards enabling science. And so we have been thinking about how can we truly look at these elements of the cyber infrastructure as an ecosystem that can be used collectively towards driving innovation, driving discoveries. And finally, uh, given that we are in an era where we are seeing tremendous disruptions in the technology landscape as we explore post-Moore's law, as we look at new emerging applications that are using streaming data, that are leveraging machine learning and artificial intelligence, how do we continue to make sure the cyber infrastructure ecosystem evolves and is continuing to drive innovation, enabling new types of applications, new types of science? So NSF has a vision that it has shared with the community in terms of how do we continue to build a national cyber infrastructure ecosystem for the 21st century. It has a vision for an agile, integrated, robust, trustworthy, and sustainable CI ecosystem that drives new thinking and transformative discoveries in all areas of science and engineering, research and education. The plan is at the URL at the bottom of this slide. It's based on a few different principles. I talked about viewing CI holistically so these elements can work together. Supporting translational research to make sure that we can take the innovation in computing, in technology, and bring them to bear towards enabling science and engineering. And how do you make sure that you support that translational arc, the translational research to make that happen? How do you balance innovation with stability? We want to continue innovating in the cyber infrastructure, but at the same time, We want to make sure that we have a stable cyber infrastructure ecosystem that scientists and researchers can depend on. How do we couple discovery and innovation cycles across disciplines? And how do we make sure that the cyber infrastructure ecosystem is usable and is impactful for the science community that it serves? Along with this vision, NSF has also released a sequence of blueprints that outline how it intends to implement this vision along different dimensions of the cyber infrastructure ecosystem. Again, if you go to the URL, you can download all these documents, and we always welcome your feedback on these documents. And as a result of this vision, we have been implementing a cyber infrastructure ecosystem over the past few years. This is what our computing ecosystem looks like. As you can see, it is a very diverse, distributed set of resources that span different types of computing paradigms, different types of architectures. It includes leadership class computing, such as the Frontera system that enables science at scales that's not possible otherwise. It also includes a range of different capacity systems, from systems such as Expanse that target the long tail of science, cloud-like systems such as Jetstream, large memory systems such as Bridges, GPU systems such as Delta, again, long tail science systems that support long tail science such as Anvil, right? So it's a range of systems that bring different capacities, different capabilities together to support the broadest set of users. It also includes innovative systems such as, for example, Okami, which leverages the Japanese exascale processor by Fujitsu and ARM and makes it accessible to the US community. I think this is the first US-based system that uses this processor. It just recently came online. It also includes systems such as NeoCortex, which leverages the Cerebros AI wafer scale processor, as well as Voyager, which leverages the Intel Habana processors, right? So it's a very diverse set of resources to make sure we can address broad science needs, but it's complemented by services such as Exceed, which provides allocation, user support, operational services, and OSG Path, which provides federated federation services to support high throughput computing, right? So together we have a, a really holistic computational ecosystem, and then complemented by other NSF investments, such as its cloud investments, testbeds such as Chameleon and Cloud Lab, but also Cloud Bank, which allows academic researchers to leverage cloud services, and then the NCAR system, Shaheen. Now you can see that you have a really a broad ecosystem, and just as a evidence of the impact of having such an ecosystem is the fact that a very large percentage of users, right, over 43% of the projects and a large percentage of the cycles used came from NSF resources. One of the reasons why the HPC consortium was able to get to be launched in a week was the fact that we could leverage the services provided by Exceed and build the entire allocation process and the process for receiving proposals and evaluating proposals on top of the Exceed services, right? So the fact that we could leverage these investments really what enabled the HPC consortium to be launched quickly, but also to have the impact that it was able to have, right? And complementing this with resources coming from DOE and NASA and our international partners and industry, now you have a truly national, international consortium that provides the computing resources needed to support and address the research to fight a global pandemic. Longer term, NSF has a vision for a truly national research cyber infrastructure ecosystem that not only leverages a broad set of resources that range from leadership computing, cloud services, advanced capacity systems, campus cyber infrastructure instruments, and creates a really a federated ecosystem that allows for seamless discovery and ecosystem, but then layers on top of that the services that are needed to be able to democratize access to this infrastructure across all of science and engineering research. And we have been moving strategically towards implementing this vision. And at the national level, uh, this vision really aligns with what was put forward by the recently released strategic plan on the future advanced computing ecosystem, right? Which talks about a computing ecosystem that spans government, academia, nonprofits, and industry. It talks about different dimensions of the ecosystem, such as including data and sustainable software. It talks about the importance of translational research, as well as the need for the expertise and a flexible workforce. And all of these elements really are reflected in NSF's vision for its cyber infrastructure ecosystem that it is implementing. As I mentioned, there were two takeaways in my mind. The first one we just talked about. The second one was really around the processes and structures for implementing HPC consortium, right? When we got started, there was a shared sense of urgency, the need to do something, which allowed us to really create an environment of trust and ad hoc processes that build on that trust to put this resource together, right? And this worked really well, and we were able to execute and have an impactful consortium. But also, if in the longer term, such an ad hoc structure can have uh, undesired effects, right? For example, we had to divert resources from the regular science and engineering research that they support to support COVID-related research. And so that really can have impact, for example, in terms of long-term competitiveness. Right? There was the ad hoc processes created additional workload at a very difficult time for the people involved, the operators, the people who are involved in evaluating projects and supporting researchers. Um, there was really a lack of coordination structures and agreements in place, right, led to issues around intellectual property and data sharing that proper planning could have avoided and can avoid, and so on, right? So if we were to look back and at the lessons learned, right, if you can think about what are the appropriate structures, processes, partnerships, agreements, and if you can put them in place, then we can ensure that we can mobilize such a consortium whenever there's a time of urgent need, whenever there's a national urgency, and make sure that it is as effective as it can be and maximize its impact, amplify its impact of a consortium. Right? So with these thoughts in mind, there's been discussions around a possible National Strategic Computing Reserve, or NSCR. The idea is to create a coalition of experts and resource providers that um, with the right structures and processes in place so that it can be mobilized quickly to provide critical computational resources, compute, but also software, data, and technical expertise whenever there is an urgent need, right? So uh, the idea is to define, to think about all these processes, all these agreements that are in place to make sure that we can uh, identify the partnerships that are needed, the stakeholders, and make them aware of this resource, so that again, when there's an urgent need, we can be agile, we can be expedient, and we can be impactful to address this the need. Um, the thinking in this is in early stages. There was an request for information issued by OSTP in December. We had a bunch of responses that came in January, and we are still evaluating those responses. But they were aligned with a lot of these ideas of the vision, the idea that such a resource, such a reserve can be tremendously impactful, that establishing these structures, establishing the different agreements, establishing partnership with the proper stakeholders and other reserves, making sure that we have the agreements around data sharing and IP in place, making sure that there are the right uh, exercises to make sure the actual reserve is ready to respond, right? So it really outlines the responses did highlight all these issues, and so we're thinking about, okay, digest these responses and develop what the next steps should be. So to conclude, I think the message here is that computing and data will continue to play an important role. And so if that is the case, then the National Advanced Cyber Infrastructure, including HPC, but also the software and the data infrastructure and the expertise and the networking, is a strategic asset that can really help address and respond to these emergencies. And so it's important to establish the right processes and partnerships and structures to make sure that we can mobilize such a reserve, such a infrastructure, and make sure it does have the impact so that we don't have to do things um, in an ad hoc way in the future. And finally, it's important to realize that we can only do this if we have this ready reserve of resources. And that means that we continue our long-term strategic investments in the cyber infrastructure ecosystem so that when there's an urgent need, we have the capabilities that we can build such a consortium on. With that, I'm going to